Welcome to our channel, where each video is a step into the world of mysteries and the unknown. Here we dive into the deepest and darkest corners of the human imagination, where real horrors are intertwined with mystical stories. If you are looking for thrills and want to experience how your heart will beat faster from fear, you have come to the right place. We present you stories that will make you ask yourself questions that have no answers. Subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new, frightening releases, and turn on notifications to be the first to encounter what lurks beyond the everyday. Are you ready to find out what's hiding in the dark? With us, you will look where the light does not penetrate, and you will feel the fear that stays with you for a long time. An old hospital is located in a small town in the south of the United States, where winds whistle through empty streets and houses stand abandoned as gloomy witnesses of the past. Starkville Hospital was known for its medical staff, who, put it mildly, were not distinguished by delicacy. Over the years, after a series of horrific incidents, the building was abandoned, but its reputation remained alive. A young medic, Katie, began her practice at this institution, sincerely believing that the horror stories she had heard were an exaggeration. However, her first day at work quickly destroyed this illusion. Katie, while in the emergency room, began to notice oddities. There doesn't seem to be anything supernatural. Broken lamps, broken air conditioners, stinking of burnt-out wires. But soon her attention was drawn to details that were much scarier. One day, while looking through the archives, Katie came across documents concerning patients who were admitted to the hospital under extremely suspicious circumstances. These documents contained eerie details about how many of them disappeared or died under incomprehensible and shocking conditions. One of the old reports mentioned mysterious experiments that were carried out at this hospital. Katie found descriptions of medical procedures that went beyond all morality and professional ethics. Patients were subjected to painful and unauthorized operations without anesthesia. Some of them were simply abandoned in the department, left to die of pain and fear. The mysteries began when Katie found a record that several people had disappeared the day before the hospital closed, and in some cases their bodies were found in a terrible state, decomposed, mutilated beyond recognition. Katie, studying the documents, plunged deeper into the darkness of the hospital's history. One entry in particular caught her attention. She described cases where patients went missing and their bodies were found in terrible condition. Some reports mentioned that the bodies were mutilated beyond recognition, and some were even found in a partially decomposed state. These patients were left in the ward as if they had been deliberately forgotten or left to die in suffering. With each document she read, Katie felt a growing sense of anxiety. The pages became increasingly ominous when she came across notes about experimental procedures that used not only outdated, but also clearly unethical medical methods. Some patients were subjected to incredible pain without any control. Their conditions ranged from death from infection to excruciating agony. One night, after a long day at work, Katie was left alone in the building. The incessant sounds coming from the neighboring wards reminded her that something terrible had once happened here. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, and faint glowing spots began to appear in the corridor at night, which disappeared as soon as she tried to get closer. One night, when Katie was looking through the archives again, in the silence of the corridor, her attention was attracted by strange sounds from one of the wards. These sounds were like faint sobs and rustles that Katie couldn't explain. When she got to the door, she saw that it was ajar, and a faint light was visible in the room. Inside the ward, Katie saw an old chair and a lot of antique medical instruments covered in dust. There was a metal table in the corner of the ward with sticky blood dried on the surface. There were scraps of medical records on the table, with words written on them that she couldn't make out because of the distorted handwriting. However, some words were clearly visible: bursts, pain, and won't let go. At that moment, Katie noticed that a dark stain was forming on the floor, similar to a spilled liquid. Trying to keep calm, she began to move cautiously towards the exit when she suddenly felt something cold touch her feet. It was like icy fingers reaching out from under the floor. Horrified, She looked down and saw that dark jets were pouring out of the cracks in the floor, which gradually filled the ward. When Katie saw dark jets shooting out of the cracks in the floor, her body was seized with paralyzing fear. His feet seemed rooted to the floor. Dark jets rapidly filled the room, and the air became humid and fetid. Katie noticed that the stain on the floor was growing and starting to move towards her. Unable to bear the sight, she tried to go to the door, but found that it was jammed. With difficulty, she jerked the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic seized her when she heard ominous sounds similar to screams and moans, as if someone was begging for help. Began to be heard outside the walls. There was a high-pitched crackling sound inside the room, and Katie saw red liquid begin to leak out of an old chair. She realized with horror that it was blood. The chair began to move by itself, as if someone invisible was sitting on it and mocking her fear. At that moment, her phone refused to work. I desperately tried to call the emergency services, to no avail. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Katie looked back and saw that the dark spot on the floor had taken on an even more sinister shape. Now it looked like a whole wormy mass crawling towards her. Caught up in the horror, she noticed that textures and words written in blood began to appear on the floor. One word that was especially clearly visible sounded like "stay." At that moment, she saw strange shadows begin to move across the floor, forming into human figures. But they weren't just shadows or shapes. Katie suddenly realized that there was actually a man in the room, a maniac hidden in the shadows. His face was disfigured, distorted, like a man who had suffered terrible torment. His eyes were empty, but with an unnatural glint. The maniac slowly approached her. His footsteps could be heard against the background of sounds that seemed to be the curse of this place. He was not an ordinary person, but rather a sinister being whose intentions were clear. His hands were covered in blood, and cut pieces of cloth and antique medical instruments were sticking out of his clothes. Katie noticed that his eyes radiated not only pain but also malice, as if he were burdened with hatred and a thirst for revenge. He seemed to enjoy her fear, slowly approaching and letting her panic grow. When the maniac grabbed her shoulder with his ice-cold hands, Katie felt a terrible pain permeating her body. His touch was like a tearing torment, a reminder of the brutal procedures that may have been carried out in this hospital. He began to drag her to the center of the ward, where there was a table spread out with the remains of medical instruments. Katie, more and more terrified with every step, saw that the maniac wasn't just going to kill her. His intentions were much more perverse. He continued to pull her towards the table, preparing for what was supposed to be not just an act of violence, but a real test of survival. At that moment, when the fear reached its peak and her mind was already beginning to lose itself, Katie felt that her last moments were close. The maniac, smiling cunningly, began to prepare tools, and Katie desperately tried to find at least some way to save herself. The walls of the ward were like an impregnable barrier, and her opportunities to leave this place were rapidly running out. Katie, full of horror, felt that her time was running out. The maniac continued to prepare his tools with eerie calm, pulling on gloves and cleaning knives. Katie desperately tried to find a way out. The walls of the ward seemed impenetrable. Her only chance was to try to distract the maniac. She turned over several objects and screamed in desperate fear, hoping that this would somehow change the situation. The maniac, with insatiable pleasure in his eyes, slowed down his movements and his attention switched to her screams. This was only a temporary salvation. When Katie tried to escape again, she came across a mountain of old medical instruments that the maniac used for his perverted purposes. She tried to pick up something to protect herself, but her hands were shaking and she was completely hopeless. The maniac, noticing her efforts, casually approached her and put a cut medical mask on her, trying to keep her under control. His laughing laughter and hideous face intertwined with her thoughts, creating an unbearable atmosphere of fear. With a terrible stench that gradually filled the room, the maniac brought her to the table. His plan was obvious. Katie was supposed to be part of his sinister research. She felt her body constricted by terror, and even the last moments of despair could not change the situation. When the maniac finished his preparations and pinned her to the table, her last thoughts were about how she did not have time to leave this place alive. Her last screams died away in the suffocating darkness, and soon the maniac completed his bloody deed. When the room fell silent again, Katie remained on the table. Her body was bleeding, and the maniac disappeared, leaving her as a warning to those who might be in this place. Starkville Hospital has preserved its dark legacy, and its walls have once again absorbed a terrifying story.